Hello everyone, welcome to this session of Karwan Online History Festival Season 2. Today I am joined by an eminent historian, Professor Shekhar Bandyopadhyay sir, all the way from New Zealand, and he'll be delivering a lecture on decolonization, change and continuity. Let me just give a small introduction of our speaker, though he doesn't need an introduction, and we all have read his books. He's a professor and director at New Zealand India Research Institute and has published several books and many articles in his field. So, caste culture and hegemony, social dominance in colonial Bengal, caste protest and identity in colonial India, the Nam Shudras of Bengal in 1872 to 1947, and caste and politics and the Raj, Bengal 1872 to 1937 are some of his books. I have one of his book with me right now, From Plassey to Partition and After. And in 1992, he joined Victoria University, where he has been deputy dean and an associate dean, research in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. And before going to Victoria, he taught at University of Calcutta and Kalyani University in India. Educated at Princeton College and University of Calcutta, Professor Bandyopadhyay's primary research interest is in the history of nationalism and caste system in colonial and post-colonial India. So welcome to the session, sir, and over to you.
Okay, thank you, Eshan, for your kind introduction and also for inviting me to this lecture series that you are organizing on behalf of the Karwan Enterprise. I think this is a very good enterprise in the days of pandemic when we are all stuck in our homes. These webinars and live Facebook seminars are the only ways to exchange ideas and for scholarly interaction uh, between students and teachers across the world. So, thank you very much for organizing these sessions and also for inviting me. So, as I have proposed to speak on the theme of decolonization, uh, change, and continuity. This is a topic some of you might know that on which I have been working for last few years. I published a book and also edited a book on the same theme. So I'll be drawing from my work, and but I'll mainly be focusing on India this time, not South Asia in general, because the time is limited. So, what I will do, I'll first go with some initial comments on the historiographical debate around the concept of decolonization. And then I will go into more specific empirical examples taking from India and mainly confining myself to the first 5 years or at the most the first decade after independence. So, I mean, decolonization is now a very popular term among historians, political scientists, and there are many definitions, or I might say definitional debates on this concept. In a more narrower sense, decolonization is depicted as a political event, which meant the end of European empires in Asia and Africa, which resulted in what Nicholas Munsey and more recently historians like John Springhall would call a transfer of power from empire to the nation state. But possibly more realistically, in this narrower definition, what is meant is a transfer of power from a colonial elite to an indigenous elite. But the most important aspect of this definition is that here decolonization is seen as an event, as a particular event, as a political event uh, through which there is a transfer of power. And this event happens according to the specific trajectories of different imperialisms like British imperialism, French imperialism, and Dutch imperialism in Southeast Asia. Some historians in the school have also argued that the timing of this transfer of power depended on the nature of the particular imperialisms. I can mention, for example, David Anthony Lowe, who has argued that compared with the French and Dutch imperialisms, British imperialism was what he calls ambidextrous, which means it was a combination of ambivalence and oscillation. That is, on the one hand, the British Empire considered India to be a prized possession, but on the other hand, there was also a liberal expectation that there will be a time when the empire will have to wind itself. And therefore, while on the one hand, rigorous control was exerted, but on the other hand, liberal reforms were introduced. And that is why, because of this dual character of British imperialism, the winding up of the empire started much earlier in British Empire with India. And the argument is that by the 1940s, the liberal political opinion at home would not tolerate repressive suppression of the political aspirations of the colonized people. It is also argued that the economic and strategic interests of Britain in India had been dwindling. Therefore, many policymakers in London thought that it was not worth fighting for, and that's why the transfer of power happened. This is a kind of interpretative model which famous historian of decolonization John Darwin has called the metropolitan theory. There are also other historians, they argue in terms of international conditions that facilitated this decolonization as an event. And they argue that after the Second World War, the bipolar political system in the world was not conducive to the maintenance of the empire. Also, financially, Britain was too weak and was dependent on a loan from the United States. Ideologically, particularly after the signing of the UN Charter, it was difficult to sustain rigorous control over an empire when the right to self determination for every nation had been recognized. It is also argued that the structure of trade was being changed, and the British trade was now looking more towards the European markets than to the Asian markets. And so everything taken together kind of hastened the process of decolonization, particularly India or other parts of Asia was concerned. Now, what all this, both these two interpretative models look at the situation from the perspective of the metropolitan center. But on the other hand, there's a whole lot of literature, which John Darwin would call it the peripheral theory, but I would like to call it the national liberation theory, which argues that decolonization happened because of the pressure generated by the national liberation movements in Asia and Africa, and particularly India was the model. By the 1940s, the nationalist movement and popular unrest had come to such a point that it was not possible for Britain to hold on to the Indian empire any longer. John Darwin, for example, argues that the repressive regime, the coercive power which could hold on to the empire for the last 190 years was no longer working. And if we remember the classic article by Sumit Sarkar in Economic and Political Weekly, the political unrest within or outside the Congress framework had come to such a point that it was difficult for Britain to hold on to India unless it was prepared to make very substantial new financial as well as military investment, which was not possible. Particularly, even the loyalty of the army, which was being used over the years as a coercive power, the loyalty of the army was now under question. So the situation that this other interpretation on which we know there's a huge lot of literature now, that decolonization happened more as a result of the pressure from the bottom up, from what was happening in the periphery. But all these three models that I just mentioned treat decolonization as an event, that it took place for India on the 14th, 15th August of 1947. That's it. But more recent historians would think that decolonization was more a process rather than just an event. I mean, it cannot be chronologically fixed that this was decolonization, the period before this was colonial, period after this was post colonial, except perhaps the transfer of power, which was the crucial factor. But beyond that narrow definition of an event, decolonization more and more is being seen as a long drawn process because it did not merely mean withdrawal of the empire, it also meant the framing, the shaping of the nation states, their ideological orientations, their developmental models. And so all these things were happening. And this was a very complex process, not a simplistic process of rupture with the colonial past. Now, we know that many of the nationalist leaders of this period were expecting that decolonization would be a very sharp historical break. For example, in Hind Swaraj, Mahatma Gandhi argued that Indians must develop their indigenous institutions of governance. Otherwise, we might end up with English rule without the Englishmen. In other words, he and many other nationalist leaders were expecting a very sharp epistemological and structural break with the colonial past, but that kind of sharp break or rupture never happened anywhere in the world. So, in other words, there was change, definitely, but there was also continuity. The issue of continuity comes into picture because, once again, if I start with John Darwin, he argues that even when Britain was thinking of withdrawing from the empire, Britain thought of continuing protecting their very important financial and strategic interests in India, particularly through the institution of Commonwealth. Other historians, once again, if I start with David Anthony Lowe, who sees in India innumerable British type institutions which survived even after the withdrawal of the empire. In terms of the infrastructure of governance, in an article in 1949, Holden Farber, for example, wrote that India was very fortunate that it was inheriting the entire administrative, bureaucratic, and structure and infrastructure, like the offices, like the capital city itself, from the British. So it was just starting with on a very advantageous position. Judith Down also argued in her book that there was a lot of continuity in terms of the pageantry, rituals, regalia, and the institutions of governance. Now, it goes without saying that we all know that there was a lot of continuity in terms of the institutions, and other things that we inherited, like the army, the bureaucracy, the police, the judiciary. All these institutions were inherited directly from the British. And this was happening all over the other parts of the British Empire as well. But we have to admit that although there was continuity, there was change as well. It was not a very boring story of continuity or continuation of the older institutions. So, more modern historians, if I come to them now, the historians like Dipesh Chakrabarty in his introduction to a book which he and some of his colleagues have edited on decolonization, he argues, and I quote him, the decolonization process was necessarily clumsy, complicated, and inherently incomplete, that is fragmentary. That is that is to say, we cannot identify any sharp break, and on the other hand, we cannot say that it was just continuity, but it was a mixture of both continuity and change, with another historian, Sri Rupa Rai, identifies as continuity yet change. I quote her, which was in fact a kind of dialogic process between the colonial past and the post colonial present. And this dialogue took place at various levels because India, at the moment of arrival, Indian nation state, at the moment of arrival in 1947, was diverse. And there were many voices, many visions, and therefore what we can say that the dialogue was taking place, if I can borrow a term from Partha Chatterjee, it was taking place in the heterogeneous time of modernity. But on the other hand, there are also some recent historians who have argued, like Ted Sensen, who argues that it was the new political order was to a very large extent new and not old, but it was rather the experience of independence and partition which made the new appear to be old. On the other hand, there are people who say that, well, some of the institutions were inherited, were continued, but they were very substantially changed. Now, I can mention to you a very interesting work done by one of my former students. He's a Sri Lankan student, Harshan Kumar Sengam, who published his book, which is a comparative study of how the Westminster system worked in India and Sri Lanka. And what he shows that, well, yes, that to begin with, India and Sri Lanka both uh, kind of adopted the Westminster system. But the way the Indian political elite used that system, bent it, stretched it, that it did not retain its purity anymore. So, taking advantage of its flexibility and ambiguities, the system was tweaked, and not just tweaked, but in some cases substantially changed. So, what he argues that what we really find now is not really the Westminster system, which was more what he calls the Eastminster system. So, in other words, India and other parts of the other decolonized nation states inherited the institutions, but they adapted and changed according to their preferences and their particular conditions, which I can borrow another term from another scholar, Mira Asher. Mira Asher argues that it was a process of translation and transformation through which all these institutions and ideas were, in fact, being adapted here. So, in other words, the institutions were substantially changed. But if someone looks at my book on decolonization in South Asia, where I saw more particularly the West Bengal situation, I would argue that yes, the institutions were changed, but in many cases, the principles of governance were continued. I will later on explain that more details. That, in other words, it was as Chakraborty said, it was a complex and complicated and fragmentary process through which we can identify both change and continuity. The problem of understanding decolonization is that historians have just started working on this period. For a very long time, historians thought that history ended on 15th of August 1947. So they did not work on the post-independence period. And therefore, this period and the archives of this period remained unexplored for a very long time. until some of the pioneers in this field, like Bipan Chandra and his colleagues, and Ramchandra Guha and others, started working, and then others joined. So, in other words, the the new political process, which started after August 47 in India, was a complicated process. I mean, if I go back to Jawaharlal Nehru's Tryst with Destiny speech, where he argued that we have achieved political freedom, but we now have to achieve freedom from poverty, ignorance, disease, and inequality. And this was not a very insignificant struggle, and it has many aspects. And I will now look at some of these aspects to show how continuity and change occurred side by side. Now, I will, as I mentioned, there are few outstanding works in this field, and I'll start with Bipan Chandra and his colleagues' book, India After Independence, where they argue that India started with an advantageous position, that there was a consensus on how India would develop as a nation state, and this broad social consensus um, kind of rested on certain basic principles like nationalism, secularism, and democracy, and the goals of rapid economic development and radical social change, and so on. And these were the ideas which came up through the last 70 years of nationalist movement against colonial regime. So, and the major aspect, the major concept that of governance that came up or came through this movement was the idea of the principle of popular sovereignty, which was then enshrined in the constitution. Now, having said that, my reading of the nationalist movement and the post colonial political situation is that even if there was a dominant opinion which was emerging from the Congress led nationalist movement, there were also various other visions and voices which continuously contested and negotiated those dominant voice. So, in other words, it's very difficult to argue in terms of a consensus. There were dominant views and minority views, but many views were there which were jostling for space. So, it was still, I would say, when colonial rule ended and the nation state started, the nation state was still a space for contestation of various ideas of nationhood. Within the Congress, Congress was never a united kind of united political party. It was more like a movement which incorporated various shades of political views and visions. And some historians have called it Congress factionalism immediately after the independence. But I would say, and that's what I've argued in my book, that there were various visions of future within the Congress movement, and those visions contested with each other now. So it will be narrow to look at it as kind of factionalism. But one thing is clear, that the whole idea of freedom was exponentially developing throughout the period of nationalist movement. As, for example, as Sudipta Kabiraj has argued, that it was through this nationalist movement the focus shifted. In conceptualizing freedom, the focus shifted from individual freedom to collective freedom. But while articulating the collective freedom, certain collectives became privileged, and most importantly, the nation became the most important collective whose interests and aspirations were articulated. But there were other categories: class, caste, tribe, gender, which and all these collective identities were there. They were temporarily became subservient to the national interest, but they did not go. They were there. And when the nation state came into being, all these various other identities and visions it came to look for their own rights and their own spaces. So, in other words, the contest of ideas and the when freedom arrived, the process of nation building, I would say, was still unfinished. And therefore, the major developments of this period focused on how to build a consensus, how to build a nation, and it's to engulf the development. And it is there that we can try to identify the changes and the continuities. For example, to start with, that when freedom arrived on the 15th of August, the midnight of 15th August 1947, there was immediate expression of exuberance, joy. Ganesh Kuraisia has shown when, as thousands of people congregated, walked onto the streets, went to the parliament where the declaration was being made, and not just in Delhi, in other provincial metropolises like Mumbai and like Bombay at that time. Thousands of people, Jim Massalos has shown thousands of people took over the Secretariat building. In Calcutta, my own work shows that thousands of people went into the government house, the governor's residence, and for hours they were in possession of the government house, which I saw as the new citizens of the country reclaiming their space, which were more kind of sacred space of the Raj, and now the citizens of the nation states were reclaiming them. But and the other very significant aspect of this first day's celebration was that until 14th of August, in many places of India, there were communal riots were going on. And particularly, I have studied in details the city of Calcutta, which was witnessing major communal conflicts. Mahatma Gandhi was stationed in Calcutta on that day to stop the communal riots. But came 15th of August, all these conflicts were gone. I mean, they were people from various riot-torn areas were coming into the public space, and they were chanting the victory to India, and they were wearing badges with national flags and so on. And a letter to the editor in the newspaper Statesman said that on that very day, we forgot whether we were Hindus or Muslims, we are all feeling to be Indian. But if that was one kind of mood, there was also a feeling of incompleteness. There were many others who did not join the celebrations. And most important person who did not celebrate was Mahatma Gandhi himself. He was fasting to mourn the partition and to stop the communal riot. And there were others as well. On the one hand, there was Hindu Mahasabha, which did not participate in the celebration. And on the other hand, there was the Communist Party of India, the communist, who did not join the celebrations. In other words, when the freedom arrived, the nation state arrived, and the moment there was also a sense of incompleteness. But there was also a sense of anxiety in the minds of many people, which kind of continued from before that political event of transfer of power. Because if partition was meant to solve the problem of minorities, it did not. It created new minorities, that is, Hindus in Pakistan and the Muslims in India. And how people would look at these events of 15th August, as Gyan Pandey wrote in one of his articles, depended on which religious community you belong to, which class you belong to, and which geographical region you were located on that very day. So, in other words, this whole freedom and the partition came with both jubilation and anxiety, particularly in the minds of minorities that did not know what would happen to them after the Ratcliffe line would be announced. So, in other words, what I was trying to suggest that if the nation state stands on the idea of integration, that integration had not taken place there. So subsequent acts of the Indian state was to facilitate this nation building process through various rituals and through various celebrations. And 15th of August every year was celebrated with much fanfare everywhere in India. It was kind of uh, organized to generate patriotism and national integration. And recently, there's an excellent book on by Sara Ansari and William Gould, who shows that how even state mourning of deaths was organized to facilitate national integration. Like, for example, Gandhi's death in January 1948. And a few months later, the same thing happened in Pakistan. Jinnah's death in September 48 was similarly mourned by the state. And the mourning rituals and programs were organized, were thought of in such a way that they were meant to generate patriotism, meant to generate national integration, and so on. And it is often argued that if the nation building process was still unfinished in 47, it was it devolved on the Indian state gradually to ensure that. And one of the major instruments for the state to do that was the new constitution. And there has been in recent years a number of studies on how the constitution was made and how the constitution was interpreted and implemented in the immediate decolonization period or immediate after the independence or things like that. But first of all, the historians of constitution argued that when the constituent assembly was deliberating, there were many available models to choose from. It was not that there was a consensus on that basis that just came up and drafted a constitution which would be eventually accepted by everyone through consensus. There were many alternative proposals which were debated hotly within the Constituent Assembly. And these were what one scholar, Miti Mukherjee, calls this, these were multiple competing and often conflicting alternatives. And from all these alternatives, the founding fathers of the Indian Constitution came up to what we now have the Constitution. But the Constitution, the modern historians of Constitution would say that it is not a static document. It is a constantly evolving document. First of all, the new Constitution enshrined that, and where we can find, there is also one argument that the Constitution was a continuity because the new Indian Constitution accepted a significant number of articles from the previous Government of India Act of 1935. But where the change was effected was in enshrining the idea of popular sovereignty. That people were the people of India, we, the people of India, they held the sovereign power in India. I mean, that was a major change. And it also said that social justice would be a major goal and the fundamental rights of individuals would be a major goal of the Indian state. But it also said that the directive principles would be implemented by the legislatures, that is, by elected politicians, and thereby kind of putting power into the hands of politicians and thereby creating a strong state. the strong state which had power to both provide for social justice as well as control any threat to national security or any threat to any of the social rights of the people and so on. But having said that the Constitution created a strong state, um, there are a number of historians in recent years have argued, has put in the notion of people's constitution. That, well, the Constitution was drafted, it gave some certain power, even some cases authoritarian power to the central government, the state. But the Constitution was being questioned, challenged, implemented on a day-to-day basis in various incidents and various parts of the country. For example, Rohit Dey wrote a book which title is People's Constitution, Everyday Life of Law. And this is, in other words, what he shows that the provisions of the Constitution was being debated every day within the life of the Republic by the everyday citizens. And some other historians like Joy Chatterjee or Ornit Shani have argued in recent years that the Constituent Assembly was debating the Constitution, but they were not really kind of separated from the people. I just recently listened to an excellent paper by Ornit Shani where she shows that the Constituent Assembly members were receiving hundreds of letters from ordinary citizens who were demanding things, who were suggesting things, and the members of the Constituent Assembly had to take those suggestions seriously into consideration. Some of them were even referred to the Constituent Assembly and they were incorporated into the debates. In other words, while there is an idea that the Constitution was the kind of derivative and was being imposed from above, some of the recent historians shows that the common citizens had a lot to contribute to the making of the Constitution and the subsequent evolution of the Constitution as a document governing the state. For example, the whole right to the citizenship right, which the Constitution provided a definition, but this was kind of further clarified in the Citizenship Act of 1955 and so on. The other major development, and where one could argue that it was that was a sharp break with the colonial past, was the introduction of universal adult franchise, which the Constitution kind of gave us. Now, in April 1950, the Representation of Peoples Act was passed, and every citizen above 21 years of age were given the voting right. But it was a challenge because about 176 million people got voting right, but about 85% of them were illiterate. And even Nehru was not certain how the illiterate voters were going to vote. Even Dr. Ambedkar, who was the founder of the chairman of the Constitution Drafting Committee, was not sure how it would work. So the Election Commission came up with a unique idea of kind of making the ballot paper visually available to the voters. So every candidate was given a symbol. So the illiterate voter could identify the symbol and could vote according to their choices. And what is very significant that in spite of the very complex voting procedure, the Indian voters in the first election did register their political choices. And I have made a detailed study of the election in the West Bengal province, and what tells me that the voters, the new citizens of India, really considered their political options and exercised their political rights. And this was, one could argue, it's a major change from the previous system, because under the 1935 Act, hardly 10% of the adult population of India had the voting right. But it has also been argued, I mean, for example, by Dipesh Chakrabarty, that while electoral democracy was enshrined and was respected and its success was celebrated, the day to day democracy, that is, civic protest, the performative democracy, the civil protest, was not encouraged. And the state, from time to time, exerted its authoritarian power to crush such civilian unrest and political dissent. Which is, and Chakrabarty refers to a lecture by Nehru where he argues that this is now the people's government. The citizens have the right to vote every 5 years to change the government. They have the option to change the government. To the people's responsibility is now to help the government. But having said that there was a continuity of an authoritarian tendency of the state, one should also recognize that on a day-to-day basis, the state was resisted and contested by the new citizens of India. And my own research, as well as I just recently wrote Sara Ansari and William Gould's book on, which is a comparative study of the state of Sindh and Uttar Pradesh, both Pakistan and India, where they also showed the same thing, that one of the major aspects of the civil unrest was that the citizens were looking for public accountability of the political representatives as well as the bureaucrats. This could be seen in the anti corruption movement in various parts of the country. And their representatives, their elected representatives, were asked serious questions. So, in other words, there was no doubt suppression of trade union movements. Many trade union leaders were kind of had to face authoritarian hands of the state and other kind of protest. But at the same time, there were protests in everyday life. And the main aspect of it, the new citizens, they were conscious of their rights and they were asking for public accountability of their representatives and the bureaucrats. And this brings me to the issue of development and social justice. So this was the citizens, the Indian citizens, new citizens' major concern. And Nehru, in an article in 1963 in Foreign Affairs, argued that Indian nation state had two goals. One was to achieve political democracy, and the other the economic justice. And he argues that the first election in 51-52 showed that political democracy had already been established in India. So the challenge was the economic development and ensuring social justice. And he believed that it could be enforced from above through economic planning, through a planning commission and the first 5 year plan. And he had the three major goals. One was land reforms, industrialization, and building of infrastructures like dams, power plants, and so on. Now, obviously, for a new nation state, the full focus on economic development with a social justice element was certainly a new thing. But on the development, on the planning process, Benjamin Zakaria shows that these whole ideas were developing for a long time within the Congress circles since the 1930s. And all the major aspects which came into the first 5 year plan could be seen in some of the post-world economic reports, post-Second World War economic reports, which were coming out in 1944, and also in what is known as the Bombay Plan, which was drafted in 1944 by several capitalist leaders of the capitalist world in India who were close to the Congress. Zakaria argues that in course of time, between capitalist development and socialism, um, Nehru in his 63 article, and this is quite well known, he has written that socialism would be the goal of India, but socialism not bound by any doctrinaire definition of the term. Zakaria argues that in course of time, the capitalist ethos became more powerful than the socialism itself. Having said that, one could also argue that one of the major departure from the earlier tradition of development was the focus on the Panchayati Raj. And this was a new development in the sense that it was qualitatively much different than the Local Self Government Act of 1882, which had first introduced local self government in India. So the development through the village organizations, this was certainly the new thing. The other aspect, as I said, other identities, they now looked for their own protection. And and here comes the question of caste and communities. And one of the major communities which were looking for the protection from the new state were the scheduled castes. And their leader, Dr. Ambedkar, was the chair of the Constitution Drafting Committee. He was his contribution in the protection of the minority rights is that he defined the scheduled caste, or later on they came to identify themselves as Dalit, as a social group defined by their economic and social conditions. But he did not ignore religion as well, because he argued that the scheduled castes were not Hindus as such. And he wanted to have justice, social justice, ensured for this group. In terms of representation, he argued that the exclusive representation was the best option for them in the absence of universal adult franchise. So his major achievement in this sense was it was securing universal adult franchise with reserved seats for the scheduled caste, which was to continue for a decade. But on the other hand, the other minority, the Muslims, the constitution argued, and the members of the constituent assembly argued that after partition, Muslims as a minority could not claim or deserve any special protection. So they were not given any special protection. But on the other hand, the Muslims who remained in India, in a political way, they began to adapt to the situation. First of all, the Muslim League disbanded itself. And then the other Muslim elites, they left their demand, they gave up their demand for exclusive representation. And from now on, they began to either identify with the mainstream politicians, or what Hilal Ahmed has said, that they tried to secure in representation informally, so through various other organizations and through collaboration with other bodies and so on. So in other words, the Muslim political situation remained somewhat under the radar. On the other hand, the scheduled caste movement began to gain momentum, although they had the reservation. The major contribution of Dr. Ambedkar, as Aparna Rao has said, was the politicization of untouchability and caste disability. So this Ambedkar tradition went on through the Republican Party, and later on the Dalit Panthers, and various other organizations began to come through. So in other words, in political terms, we find some of the continuities from the previous period, from the colonial period, but these continuities uh, were certainly the new normal of the post-colonial period. As for the Muslims are concerned, their anxiety continued because the refugees kept coming. And as the refugees kept coming, the pressure on the Muslims who remained continued, and they were being suspected, their loyalty to the Indian nation state was being questioned and sustained or questioned on a daily basis. And as a result, what happened? That the two parts of the two new parts of the British Empire, that is India and Pakistan, the minorities, particularly the Muslim minority in India and the Hindu minority in Pakistan, were kind of held as hostages for the security of their counterparts. So what happened in 1950? So after 3 years after independence, something happened in East Pakistan, and as a result of that, the East Pakistani situation, it was an anti-insurgency movement which affected the Hindu minorities in East Pakistan, and some of them started migrating. And in retaliation, there were riots in Calcutta 3 years after independence. And when riots began to take place in Calcutta and other places, there were Muslim migration from West Bengal into East Pakistan. And when Muslim migration started, there were again widespread riots in East Pakistan. And once again, Hindu refugees started coming from East Pakistan into West Bengal. This was the second wave of migration, the refugee migration after partition. So far as West Bengal is concerned, the first wave brought in about 11 lakhs of refugees, the second wave about 24 lakhs. And the second wave continued up to from 1950 up to 1957 when finally the borders were closed. So in other words, if independence and partition were meant to solve the problem of the minorities in the subcontinent, it certainly could not. But the problems became manifest in very significantly other ways. I'm telling this that in terms of political situation, I'm coming to an end. I think uh, very quickly I'll come to an end. The Hindu right-wing politics, the Hindu Mahasabha also faced a crisis after Gandhi's assassination. And they had a soul searching around this time. There was a major ideological debate within the Hindu Mahasabha after Gandhi's assassination. And some of the leaders, like Sama Prasad Mukherjee, had suggested that the Hindu Mahasabha need not carry on any further because independence has already come. But that debate ended in the more conservative section of the Hindu Mahasabha gaining ground. Sama Prasad Mukherjee, as a result, resigned from Hindu Mahasabha and formed the Bharatiya Jansangh as a new democratic party. I mean, I have to reiterate this, and I've written an article on this. If we look at the initial memorandum of the Jansangh, it was meant to be more universalist, but it later on became moved more towards the Hindu right. On the other hand, the other aspect is that, which I'll quickly finish, is the crisis of the Communist Party. As I mentioned at the very beginning, there were various competing voices, competing visions. One of them, if the Hindu argument was one of them, the communist argument, the communist model vision was certainly the other one. The communists also went through a major change over this period. They initially thought that the Telangana way, the armed insurrection, was the way to go. And so Telangana and the Tebhaga movement in Bengal were renewed, but this did not go very far. And they came back to the parliamentary democratic system. They agreed that they decided to fight the election in 1952. And in the 1952 election, they emerged as the largest opposition party. This is a very significant new development, that the Communist Party emerges as a parliamentary party, and they came to constitute the largest opposition party in the parliament. But at the same time, what I mean, I'm very attracted to Javid Alam's point. Javid Alam said that all through this period, the Communist Party made the state, the bourgeois state, as its main enemy. And by doing that, it did not focus on the social education, the social consciousness of its followers. And therefore, when the militant movement, the insurgencies, um, kind of subsided, their members could not adopt the new values, the new secular values of the new nation state, and therefore the communists could not really transform the society as a whole. So I will end there. I have already taken a lot of time. I will end at what I'm suggesting, that in every sphere of politics and in institutions that we developed in the first, say, decade after the independence, um, all these spheres were comp- witnessed complex process of continuity and change, which were fraught with multiple alternative possibilities, where old nationalisms were interrogated, new identities were born, and fresh boundaries were drawn, both geographically and socially. And the continuity was palpable as much in the ideational level as in the structures, but it is also difficult to separate the continuities from the changes that were happening within every sphere. So it was never a clinical break, nor an uneventful continuity. That was the decolonization process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for this wonderful lecture. Easy to understand and very detailed. So, this first question, we'll move to the conversation directly. This first question is from Muskan Jain. Her question is, if India was decolonized because its management became unsustainable for the British after the World War II, how come the British still held on the territories in Africa and the Caribbean until much later?
Yeah, the scholarship on decolonization says that even when the colonial office was thinking about withdrawing from India, they were not really thinking of dismembering the empire. The nationalist movements in Africa started much after the nationalist movement started in India. In fact, India kind of offered a model which many of the African countries were following. Many of the African leaders looked towards India for their model, which they followed in their own country. So India's nationalist movement was much more mature, much more politicized, much more powerful than many other countries in Asia and Africa. And therefore, I mean, looking at the situation in the 1940s, it was difficult for Britain to hold on to India, but Britain was in no mood yet to give up its other parts of the empire. So that will be my brief answer to the to that question.
There was a speech by Dr. Shashi Tharoor at the Oxford Union in 2015 where he said that British owe reparations to India. So, and this is very contentious issue these days. So, how do you make out of this issue in the present context?
Well, uh, reparation is a valid issue. How much Britain, how much wealth and money Britain extracted from India is a matter of finer calculation. But the fact that they extracted in wealth from India is beyond doubt. That they took away many of India's treasures. You can see if you visit British Museum. And so, but reparation is a political debate. It's a matter of political negotiation. One of the major, I mean, Bia Tomlinson, for example, argues that one of the major reasons why Britain left India was that because of the Second World War, Britain became indebted to India, and Britain's debt amounted to about 1/5 of Britain's GDP. Now, Britain never repaid that debt. It was negotiated and ultimately written off. It's a complex process. I cannot go into that. So there are many aspects of it. There's no question that wealth was taken away, but whether we could claim, demand a reparation, whether Britain would be agreed to pay reparation, that is, I think, a matter of political negotiation, which a historian cannot comment. A historian can only say, yes, a lot of money was taken away.
So this question is from Rukmani Banerjee. You mentioned Subdipta Kaviraj in your lecture. So how do you place subaltern studies in the Indian historical context of decolonization efforts and our current understanding, and offer conflation of nationalist history with the homogeneous Indian experience and participation in the freedom movement?
Yeah, I think my own view is subaltern studies has made a significant contribution. You may not completely agree with them in many aspects. You can contest some of their observations and conclusions, but you cannot deny they have made a significant contribution to the understanding of Indian situation. And one of the major contributions which I believe they have made us conscious about the plurality of the national movement, which I look at it in a different way. I mean, you were showing my book, Passage to Partition, and after I have a chapter there called Many Voices of a Nation. So, in other words, what subaltern studies has brought to the forefront is our awareness about this multiplicity of voices. But how would you look at those voices and how would you relate them to nation? That is up to you. I mean, there can be contestation, there can be debate on that, whether there was a nation at all or no nation. There was a nationalism, then Aloysius' book, Nationalism Without a Nation. But that's a different aspect of it. But this plurality, the recognition of plurality, others have also said, but they have made a major point of it. That is, I think, a major contribution of the subaltern studies, which we cannot ignore. I mean, we may not agree with everything they have said, but that's their major contribution.
This question is from Pragya Kapil. That did opium bankroll the British Empire? How did the end of British Empire affect Britain? It's a very basic question, but yeah, important to understand.
Can you read out once again? Oh,
Did
sorry, opium?
opium bank the British Empire?
Not entirely. I mean, opium was a major revenue earner, but there were others. I mean, if we agree with the economic historians that there was drainage of wealth, there were many drains through which there are many pipelines through which this wealth was drained out. For example, railway investments. That was a major money earner where the British investors could invest without any risk, but only the profit. The home charges, the industrialization itself, the the differential imperial tariff system. So there were many other pipelines through which money was extracted and which sustained the British Empire. One of the major instruments which was developed, funded by the Indian taxpayers, which sustained the British Empire for a very long time, was the British Indian Army. Until the 1930s, British Indian Army could be used anywhere in the world to defend the empire, and the entire expenses would be borne by the Indian taxpayers. So colonial rule used Indian exchequer, Indian taxpayers in various ways. Opium was certainly one of them, no doubt.
So there are some questions from the audience. We'll take few questions from there. Aditi Bose's question is, would you say that there has been a conscious resurgence of the notion of empire building processes in the present times in terms of drawing national and international territorial boundaries?
I don't think empire in the old form would come back. Empire in the old form in the new world order is difficult to maintain. So this is time of the informal empire where superpowers would like to control the economic resources of various other parts of the world. I need not name names of the countries we all know. So it is more in terms of military hegemony in order to ensure economic extraction, but not direct political control. So it will be empire. There will be empire, but in a different form. Not the old European empire will come back. I don't think so. That's not tenable anymore.
Amlan Singha's question is, why the alternative voices of Indian modernity lost its popularity to Congress's ideology, Nehruvian or Gandhian? Was it only due to popularity of Congress among Indian masses or repressive measures taken by Congress government in provinces?
Okay. Now, what I would like to know that the alternative voices did not die. The alternative voices remained there and contested the dominant voice. And otherwise, today we would not see all those voices coming up again. If the repression was that total, then all those voices would have been repressed and smothered and totally permanently silenced. That never happened. That never happened because there was, I mean, the Nehruvian state, it used from time to time authoritarian power, but there was always a space for dissent. And in that space, all these alternative voices that I mentioned have maintained their existence, have continued to question an authoritative state whenever it became authoritative. So the basic democratic structure, the basic democratic system kind of allowed these other alternative voices to survive, continued to question the people who were in power. So, yeah, I mean, I will put the situation in a slightly different way.
So you mentioned dissent. So there's a question by Jayashri Teli that what is the relevance of colonial era laws in the contemporary times, such as those concerning to the sedition charges, Freedom of the Press Act, personal laws, blasphemy? How does the independent country seeks to differ from the colonial version? How to decolonize the laws?
Yeah, I mean, that's a debate which Indian citizens should have. And this is a debate which has been, I would say, going on for 70 years and not ended. I mean, as I mentioned at the very beginning, decolonization is not an event that happened just in 47 and ended. Decolonization is a continuing process. And in that sense, we have not been decolonized ourselves totally. And that debate should be raised, should be taken up by the Indian citizens, that why would the colonial laws would not be changed in a new situation of nation state where the people are sovereign. So the people who are the sovereign power in India needs to take up that debate and raise that very valid uh, point, that why should they still be continuing in the new situation where we agree to a democratic structure, where we have a fundamental right of press freedom and fundamental right of freedom of expression. So sedition, which colonial state looked at sedition in one way, should a people's republic look at sedition in the same way? So that's the question which the citizens of India should raise.
So there is a question by how do you look a scheduled caste in participating decolonization process?
Yeah, I mean, they participated in a very significant way. I mean, one of the major aspect of decolonization was the drafting of the new constitution, and the drafting committee was chaired by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. This is a fact which very rarely kind of recognized. But what the decolonization process, I mean, kind of established or made us conscious of is the problem of injustice, is the problem of social disparities, that the fact that Indian constitution made social justice the most important principle around which all other things have been constructed. That is one major contribution of people like Dr. Ambedkar and their movement. So, as I was referring to Aparna Rao's position, that they helped to politicize the issue of caste discrimination in India. And that is, I think, one of the major aspects of decolonization process, which started with the framing of the Indian Constitution, Article 17, which made untouchability illegal. So, which
Yeah.
started with the Article 17, but that process has not ended. As I keep saying, that the decolonization process is an unending, continuing process.
Yes. So there are some continuities as you pointed out. So it's a question by Vaishali Divakar. It's a rather long question, but I'll just summarize it for you that will you please tell more on the decolonizing gender, especially women, in the post independence period? So do we see any continuities in the post colonial period?
Yes, it is both continuity and change. It's both continuity and change. First of all,
So
in terms of frustration, that where the process of change was kind of stalled, was the way the Hindu Code Bill was stopped by the conservative elements within the within the parliament, and that was one major reason why Dr. Ambedkar uh, left the ministry, left his cabinet position, and left the Congress. Because Hindu Code Bills, one of the major beneficiaries of Hindu Code Bill would be the women, who would get their property right uh, in their of their families, and so on. And so that is where the conservatism of the earlier period continued. But on the other hand, the political the political conscientization also began. Women in the first years of post-colonial period were becoming conscious of their political right. I will mention one particular aspect. I mean, if I use this example in my book, Decolonization in South Asia, it's about the first election in 1951-52, where women participated, actually came out to vote in a major way. There are many other things which Nehru came up, because when the voting roll, voters' roll was being made, many women would not say the names of their fathers or of their husbands, so their own names. So they were entered in the voters list as somebody's wife or somebody's daughter or somebody's sister. And Nehru simply said that won't work, and he just struck off all those names. But despite that, if you look at the voting behavior of women in the first election of 1951-52, that was quite impressive. And the example which I was going to give you is a cartoon. Is a cartoon which came out in Amrita Bazar Patrika, where it shows that a wife was beating her husband, and it says the husband had told her to vote certain candidate, but she did not, and in protest she was beating the husband. Now my position is that this is not a matter of joke. In 1951, for Amrita Bazar Patrika, it was a joke. That is why it was making a cartoon. It was actual news. It happened in one of the election booths. But what I said, that a woman in 1951 in a village of West Bengal could resist the orders of her husband about how to exercise her voting right, that is something of a major change. Now, women's question is a very complex question. I mean, this is just one major example. This does not absolutely mean that women's position improved with decolonization. So, as I say, there were some changes, there was some consciousness among women that were coming, but Indian patriarchy is very powerful, and it requires long struggle. And I cannot say that there was a radical change. No, absolutely not. The pace of change almost remained the same, but nevertheless, the new freedom, the new citizenship, the consciousness of a citizen's right, these began to bring about changes in some women's life as well.
Yes. So, in the context of 1951-52 elections, how do you analyze the role played by the caste at the cusp of decolonization, and in those which took place in the 1970s and 80s? So how do you compare both?
Caste remained a factor in the electoral politics, certainly in 1951-52. This has two aspects. First of all, the reserved seats. The reserved seats for the scheduled castes, where most of the candidates still belonged to the Congress, because Congress was still at the height of its popularity. It was still claiming the legitimacy or as inheritor of the nationalist, the legacy of the nationalist movement. And in 1951 first election, Nehru played a very big role. Nehru would, being a very modern secularist, would not play the caste card. But there is evidence when the nominations were fixed, nominations were being finalized by the Congress Electoral Committee, caste was certainly a major factor. that was taken into consideration. That is, in constituencies where the one caste dominated, most invariably the candidate would be from that caste. And it happened with all the political parties. And the communist MLA Manikuntala Sen, she writes in her autobiography that she was quite thunderstruck when she learned that her own party was nominating candidates of a particular caste because that particular caste was the dominant caste in that locality. For example, in Midnapur, the Mahishos are the majority. So she said, Midnapur, my party would never nominate a non Mahisho. So the caste was certainly a major factor in terms of nomination. Um, it's a very complex question because in India, for many years, people's identity was associated with his or her caste. And caste acted as a conduit for ideas as well. For example, when the communist movements were being organized, I mean, I'm taking the examples of the communists who, as such, do not or as such claim not to accept caste. Even when the Tebhaga movement was being organized in North Bengal, one of the major studies shows that the mobilization was taking place by using the caste-based community organizations. Because those were the structures, the social structures which were readily available for social mobilization. And therefore, when election came, caste organizations were the more easily available structures which political parties could use for social mobilization.
So we'll take three more questions before we end the session. This question is about South India, that how do you look at South India and the Dravidian politics in the context of decolonization?
Yes, I could not come to the language politics. I did not have time. And also because language politics, for this lecture, as I said at the very beginning, I wanted to focus on the first 5 or 10 years. The language movement starts much later, except the Andhra movement. Um, uh, Now, that's about the Dravidian movement, about Tamil nationalism. That's the point which I wanted to mention at the very beginning, that when independence came, when the new nation state was born, there were many visions about the future of the state. And those visions were not to lose distinctive identities and become a homogeneous whole, but the visions were to maintain distinctive identities and yet identify with the nation. Dravidian movement was not defying, not rejecting the nation state, but Dravidian movement certainly needed to be recognized as a distinctive identity within that pluralist whole. So, in other words, there was a lot of debate, and this whole thing came to a head with the debate on what was going to be the national language or official language of India. When the North Indian politicians wanted Hindi to be the official language, and there was a major resistance, and ultimately the compromise was found that Hindi was not imposed on everyone. English remained an alternative language. So that was the good thing that was done. But there is always a kind of demand. That is the problem. I mean, that is the problem of nation state, because nation state by definition looks for a homogeneous whole. There will be one state, one language, one culture, everything one. So I have spoken on it number of times that Indian nation at the time of its arrival was a pluralist nation. And that pluralist nation was being united, and Nehru and the Nehruvian government kind of popularized the idea of unity in diversity. I often argue that one should kind of reverse that slogan. Unity is there. I mean, no one really wants to go out of India. So we should look for diversity in unity. Having recognized the unity, we should not forget the fact of diversity as well. That gives the Indian federal structure a sustainable life.
Yes.
So I'll put
Yes. This question is from Chitran Deshmangalam. His question is, how do you see the history of the idea of populism as important in the process of decolonization? Because populism is still used today as a political tool to obtain acceptance from the masses.
populism in the way we are seeing it today. I don't see that in the initial period of decolonization. There was more debate. I mean, some amount of populism remains in democratic politics always, but what we see today, the kind of populism which we see all over the world, that kind of populism I do not see in the initial period of decolonization, but there were elements of populism in the nationalist movement as well. I mean, people, when they follow certain leaders, they often follow for various reasons. I mean, even Mahatma Gandhi had a kind of following which was not always because of what he said, but because what he symbolized. He symbolized a kind of freedom, a freedom from oppression. He symbolized that even someone without weapons or an ordinary man could challenge the mighty British Empire. So he was kind of a symbol of ordinary people challenging mighty power. So that was one kind of populism which sometimes beyond reason, but that was not the blind following, because many times Gandhi did not get response from his followers for many of his programs. So people followed him, but only they followed him when they found something tangible, something concrete in him. And the kind of populism which is beyond reason, I do not really find in the initial period of decolonization. It is possibly gradually developing.
This question is from Alkama Nasir. His question is, do you perceive the formation of group of Commonwealth nations by Britain? Do you see that it has Britain's way of reminding each colonies of Britain of its dominance over them?
To some extent, yes, I agree with that, because Commonwealth was retained, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation, as John Darwin very powerfully argues, that even when Britain was considering giving freedom to India, Britain expected that India would remain in the Commonwealth and as a part of the Commonwealth family, so that Britain could maintain its very significant financial investments and very significant strategic interests in India. The crisis arose when India wanted to become republic, because at that time, until 1950, one of the major cardinal principles of Commonwealth was that all member states recognized the queen, the head of the British Crown, as the head of their states, which India refused to accept, and India accepted the new constitution, which declared India to be a republic. And then, in order to retain India in the Commonwealth, Britain changed the rule in order to accommodate the Republic of India as a member of Commonwealth, and after that, many other republics have become Commonwealth. So yes, that was Britain's strategy to keep the previous colonies within the Commonwealth family. In all the previous colonies, Britain had very significant economic and strategic interests, which could be maintained through this Commonwealth connection. And the members of the Commonwealth also retain that connection because of the goodwill. Uh, None of the colonies have completely severed their connection with Britain, their former colonial masters, for a very long time. India's largest trading partner was Britain. So,
Yes.
and we are emotionally, temperamentally, very much remain connected to Britain. We are speaking in English. So yes, the Commonwealth was certainly a major strategy on the part of Britain to maintain the previous members of the empire, parts of the empire, tied to Britain in various ways.
Thank you so much, sir, for your wonderful lecture and for patiently answering all the queries.
Excellent. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much. And you carry on this
Thank you,
program.
everyone.
Sorry, is that the end of it? So,
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, everyone who joined us live this morning, and hope to see you all in our other sessions.